Hey guys, it's me, Halloween Dan, and I'm here today wishing you a belated Easter. Happy Easter, guys. Ooh, Easter fun, Eastery stuff. Today's video is one of the videos I like to do every now and again where I get a little bit historical and I talk about an event. In this case, Easter, because it's just been Easter. If you're new to the channel or you've never seen one of these videos that I've done before, I like to talk about where traditions come from, why we do certain things, and all that kind of stuff, because even though it's not necessarily a Halloween thing, it is linked to Halloween in a surprising, or maybe not surprising, kind of a way. I've done videos in the past, and probably will do again, where I talk about Halloween and its traditions and where many of those traditions come from, and the answer always is the pagans. The pagans, if you go far enough back in time, you'll find out that many of the traditions we do and love and enjoy and continue to use in our celebrations to this day were originated with our pagan ancestors. I did a video about this at Christmas as well, where I talked about many of the traditions that have this slightly ancient pagan vibe too, and so I thought I'd do a video about Easter, talking about that too. I suppose the only disclaimer I've got to add before we get too far into this video is a kind of a, I'm not doing this to offend anyone kind of thing. I'm not trying to be like, I'm not a pagan or anything. I do celebrate Easter and all other Christian events, but I just like talking about where these things come from, where the traditions come from, and why we do things. I think it's interesting, and I hope that some of you do too. So let's get into this. Easter is an interesting one, because I would say that of all the things we celebrate on the calendar that are, whether they're Christian or not, Easter is the most obviously pagan. And some of you might be sat there going, no it's not, what are you talking about? It's not even remotely pagan at all. But think about it for a second. Just think about it. When I was a kid, I knew, like anyone who's grown up in the Christian world knows the story of Christ. I knew about how he was crucified on the Friday and resurrected on the Sunday. That story is a huge part of growing up a Christian. And you could argue that in the Christian faith, the story of Easter is probably the most important one. You know, Christmas is great and it's about Christ's birth and stuff, but this is the real story of Christ. This is the real moment when Christ goes from just being a prophet to being a God. So I knew this story, I grew up with this story. But as a kid, and even as a teenager, there was a lot about Easter that didn't seem to add up. And most of it was about how we celebrated it. It wasn't the story, it was all about how we celebrated Easter. And for me, the biggest oddity of all was its date, or lack of. Because the most obvious thing about Easter, the thing that I think confuses everybody, to be quite honest with you, is that Easter doesn't have a set date. And it never made any sense to me as a kid. Like everything else has a set date, everything. We always know when Christmas happens, we always know when bonfire night happens, we always know when Halloween happens. Why not Easter? Why does Easter move around like it does? And for years I looked for answers and would get these really kind of vague answers. Well, it's because the church always wanted it to land on a Friday and a Sunday, you know, Good Friday, Easter Sunday. So it always had to fall, so it always moves around because the year doesn't always happen in the same way. And for a while that kind of made a bit of sense to me. But then it moves wildly, doesn't it? It's not like it always happens around about the same time, just on the Sunday or the Friday closest to this particular date. It can be in the middle of April or the end of March. It can be, you know, there can be a difference of 2 or 3 weeks sometimes between year to year. And that never made any sense to me. Then when I was a teenager, I heard someone say, oh, it's to do with the phases of the moon. Yeah, it's set by the phases of the moon. And I was kind of like, okay, that kind of makes sense. Yeah, because like The moon, yeah, is 28 days. Its phase is 28 days. A month is roughly 30 to 31 on average. So, yeah, I kind of get that. So every year it would kind of take place in a different place. But then that didn't make sense either, because that is a bit pagan, right? Like, the thing that Christianity is based upon is how not pagan it is. How just completely the opposite to paganism it is. If you know nothing else about paganism, what you probably know is that pagans pray to multiple gods, and they're gods of the weather, and they're gods of the moon, and gods of the sun, and gods of the seasons, and all that kind of stuff. And that's what paganism is. So why would the Christians set the date of the most important moment in the Christian faith to move with the phases of the moon? It didn't add up. And it just seemed overtly pagan. And then I realised that's because it is pagan. Or at least not the story of Christ, no. The date is a pagan thing. Let me explain. So back when Christianity was a very new religion, there was a big meeting, of which I've forgotten the name, that took place in Rome. Rome had just converted to Christianity, but most of the Roman Empire was still pagan. And there were lots of things they had to decide. And at this particular meeting, all the heads of the church got together and were like, these are the things that are going to go into the New Testament. This is how we're going to read the Bible from now on. And also we're going to decide the dates. They decided the dates of Christmas. They decided the dates of the saints' days and all these different things. And then they also decided the date for Easter. But like with Christmas, which if you watch my last video on this subject, you will know that Christmas is more likely dated sometime in August or September rather than December. They moved Christmas to December the 25th because it aligned with a big pagan celebration of the winter solstice, so that the Christians could sort of assimilate and go, oh, aren't we similar? We do very similar things. Why not join our religion? It's very similar, right? And the same was happening with Easter. The early Christians knew that they were basically on the lower level here. They're the lower peg. The rest of Europe was pagan. So to get the pagans on side, there was no point in going in with swords and shields and telling them what to do. They had to make this new religion seem very similar to the old religion. They had to envelop things and make them a part of how the Christians did stuff. And they did it brilliantly. They did such a good job that within 2 or 3 centuries, most of Europe was Christianized. So why does Easter fall where it falls? Well, outside of the celebration of the solstices, the summer solstice and the winter solstice, there were also very large seasonal celebrations, both in the autumn, which Samhain was a part of, and Halloween, and big ones in the spring. And it was the spring ones that made the most sense to the story of Christ, because spring is all about renewal and rebirth and coming back from the dead. And that's exactly all the symbology the pagans brought into their celebration of spring. And happening at this time all across Europe, any time after the spring equinox, which is I think the 22nd of March, I think it is, 22nd or 23rd. Spring equinox happens, and then after that, every day is then a bit longer than the night from that point onwards, and it was a big celebration. And many spring festivals and celebrations would be happening in the pagan world across Europe at this time, and most of them would happen in alignment with the full moon. So the first full moon of spring, so any full moon that took place after the 22nd of March, I'm going to say, which was the spring equinox, that's when the spring festivals would take place. The most famous, which was being celebrated across Europe, was a celebration to a spring goddess, a goddess whose name was Oster. Oster was exactly what you think. She was a goddess who brought life back to the world. She was often accompanied by rabbits and often carried eggs, and everything that she was about was all about renewal and rebirth, procreation, and just generally everything coming back into life. And it was this festival that took place at this time that the Christians went, this is what we need to do. We need to put our big festival to remember the death and the rebirth of Christ align it with this festival so that it seems so similar to the pagans and they all sort of recognize it as a similar sort of thing. So from that moment on, the celebration of Easter would always happen after the first full moon of spring, which, as we've just said, is any full moon that takes place after the date of the 22nd. I'm going to say, should have done my research. Later on, it was adapted ever so slightly by the church, just so that it wasn't based so centrally on the movements of the moon, and it had a more sort of regular date that the church could kind of keep an eye on. And because they understood it, the phases of the moon, very well, they could predict how Easter was going to fall for centuries in advance. And we're still, even to this day, how we predict where Easter's going to fall, it was set centuries ago. It's really quite amazing. But then comes everything else that we do at Easter that, to me as a kid, didn't make any sense. Like, why were we celebrating the death and the rebirth of Christ with chocolate eggs or painted eggs? What's that about? Eggs and rabbits. What have they got to do with Easter? Like, I remember going, why do we have rabbits? Why does a rabbit bring us a load of eggs? Even that doesn't make an awful lot of sense to me. And they were like, oh, well, it's because the cross that Christ was crucified on, that was it was put into a rabbit hole. Even as a kid, I knew that was stupid. But the truth is exactly what I've just talked about. It's a celebration of spring. That's what Easter is. The story of Christ has nothing to do with the celebration of spring, but the pagan celebration of Oster, which sounds a bit like Easter, is all about spring. It's about the flowers, it's about the rebirth, it's about the trees coming back into green, it's about animals, having babies and stuff. Rabbits famous for having a lot of babies. You've got the eggs, a symbol of rebirth, of renewal, of life returning. And all of these were symbols of fertility and procreation and renewal, which was what the celebration of Easter was originally all about. And so it was easier for the church who came along to take these pagan symbols of spring and adapt them into the Christian festival, because everyone would recognize these symbols. No one would be scared or put off by these symbols if they were tied in with this new religion. And that's exactly what the church knew had to be done. And it worked. And even to this day, centuries later, we're celebrating this celebration of Christ's death and then him sacrificing himself for humanity and all these huge moments with eggs and rabbits and by the phases of the moon, because the pagans, it made sense to the pagans hundreds of years ago. And that's kind of crazy when you think about it. And there's so much in how we celebrate things that we don't, all those things that don't make an awful lot of sense throughout the year that we do. And the more you look into it, the more you realise how much we owe to the pagans in a strange way, but also to those early Christians, because the early Christians knew there was no point in coming stampeding in and just saying, you have to do this our way now or we're going to throw you in a lake. They understood that it was going to be a hard transition for these pagan people. So the easiest way to make that transition easy was to take all the stuff all the traditions and the ways of celebrating that the pagans had been used to for centuries, if not millennia, and bring them into the fold, make them a part of the new Christian religion. And they did it so well that now we're doing stuff, even now in the 21st century, that doesn't maybe make an awful lot of sense to us, but made perfect sense to the pagans. And that, I think, is really, really cool. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. I know this is a really weird video that I like to do, and I know it's not technically anything to do with Halloween. It's just I really like going into the history of things and the traditions of things and why we do things the way we do them. And Halloween in its own way is also based in this. There's so much about Halloween that has its roots in this pagan, more ancient way of doing things. I love it. I find it so interesting. And so maybe a bit closer to Halloween, I might do a video like this about Halloween where I go a little bit more in depth about the history of Halloween. So stay tuned for that one. But if you got to the end of this one, guys, thank you so much, and I will see you in the next one. Keep it spooky. Bye.